If you'd like to help support this channel, visit eguitarplans.com and buy a plan. Now on with the video.
In this episode, I'm going to be covering part 7 of the Highline Guitars Echo Laminated Top guitar build. And that means I'm going to be carving the body on the CNC machine, and then I'm going to sand it all the way to perfection in preparation for applying the finish. So let's jump in and get started.
Every time I shoot a video on using my CNC machine to cut bodies and necks and fretboards and that sort of thing, I always try to find different ways to talk about how I align the blank with my CNC machine. And the way I do it is pretty simple. I made a pointer bit, and it was made out of a 1/4 inch diameter drill bit. I cut off the twists and then took the remaining shaft portion of the bit, put it into my hand drill, and ground that against the wheel on my bench grinder to get it to a nice sharpened point. Then what I do is I align the point with the center line of the blank, and then I just simply jog my router back and forth along the y-axis. And the goal here is just to make sure that that point of the bit is exactly over that center line as it moves from one end to the other. And if it isn't, I can just simply nudge it a little bit, the blank itself, and get it lined up so that the center line is directly under the point of that bit. And I'll jog it back and forth a couple of times just to make sure that I've got it precisely positioned. Once I have the blank positioned so that the center line is parallel with the y-axis, I'll then move that pointer bit to the exact center of the blank, and then I'll raise it up and then remove the pointer bit and replace it with a solid carbide 1/4 inch diameter 2-flute spiral downcut bit. At this point, the router is in the XY home position, but to get the tip of the bit into the Z home position, I lower it down until the tip of the bit is just kissing the top of the blank. And once the router is in the XYZ home position, I'm ready to start my first carving operation, which in this case is going to be the control cavity routed into the back of the body blank. Now, if you think that my CNC machine actually is running at this speed, you're wrong. I actually increased the speed of the video to save time. After carving the control cavity, the router returns to the XYZ home position where I can start the next carve, which is the comfort contours on the back of the body. For many of the cutting operations that I do, I follow a 2-carving strategy. The first carve is a rough cut that hogs out most of the wood, and then the second carve is a finishing pass which smooths out the surface. And then once I've finished all the carving operations on the back of the body, I can then remove the blank from the CNC machine, flip it over, and prepare for cutting the other side. After I flip the blank over and before I tighten the hold down clamps, I'm going to use that 1/4 inch diameter pointer bit to make sure that the blank center line is parallel with the y-axis of my CNC machine. And then I'll jog the router so that that point is directly over the exact center of the blank. Then I'll swap out that pointer bit for my carving bit in preparation for the next carving operations on the front of the body blank, which will include the perimeter shape and contours as well as all the pockets. And once again, I'm using a two carving strategy approach. For most of my 3D carving, I do a rough carve to begin with to hog out most of the wood, and then I'll follow that up with a finishing carve. However, with some of the pockets, which are more two-dimensional than they are three-dimensional, I'll just do a rough carve and omit the finishing carve since it really isn't going to be necessary. Since the body is still attached to the blank with tabs, I have to use a small keyhole saw to cut those tabs so I can remove the excess wood. Now, even though CNC machines are awesome for carving guitar bodies, one of the disadvantages is they don't do a great job of cutting sharp corners. There is a way to do it, but it's fairly time consuming to set up. So it's actually easier just to grab a chisel and carve out those corners so they'll match the shape of the heel of my neck. Obviously, since this is an electric guitar, I have to drill some holes to route the wiring from the pickups down to the control cavity. And since the vertical height of the sides of this guitar body really aren't tall enough to allow for a jack mounted to a jack plate, I'm going to use a barrel jack, and that requires a 1/2 inch diameter hole drilled from the side into the control cavity. I know a lot of guys hate sanding guitars. They think it's just way too much work. But in my opinion, this is when things really start to come together with a guitar. And I actually enjoy sanding. I think it's what separates the true luthiers from the weekend warrior wannabes. Of course, having the right tools definitely makes the process easier. And in my opinion, the key to successful sanding is being able to start out with the finest grit you can get away with, and then make sure you follow through with all the successive grits that are available instead of skipping grits. In other words, if you start with, say, 120 grit, you would then go to 150, 180, and then 220 grit. You might even go as far as 320 or 400. But if you skip any grits, you increase the potential of leaving very subtle scratches in the surface of the wood, which may not be readily apparent, but they sure will be the minute you start to apply finish. Even though I have a bunch of power sanding machines in my workshop, I still have to do quite a bit of hand sanding in order to get the surface absolutely perfect. It also helps to have really good lighting that will cast both light and shadow across the wood. It's a process that allows you to see any flaws, not only as far as scratches or tool marks, but also where corners and edges might not be perfectly formed. There's a term for this process. It's called Chiaroscuro, and it's an Italian word which refers to the way that light plays against shadow, and it's an excellent way to really gauge the accuracy of the surface you're sanding. And I use a variety of tools when I'm hand sanding, from blocks of wood to get really flat surfaces to sections of round tubing to get into some of those hard to reach areas like the horns and some of the comfort contours.
Okay, guys, well, that's all the time I've got for this episode. In episode 8, I'm going to be installing the neck into the body, and then I'll probably start to apply the finish. So be sure to check that out when it gets posted. In the meantime, if you have any comments or questions about this episode, be sure to post them down below, and I'll do my best to answer them. And of course, don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you're really into building and repairing guitars. So until the next episode, take care and I'll see you soon.